overnight, Russia has launched possibly one of the largest missile and drone barrages of the entire war, certainly the worst in many, many months, that struck a number of really critical targets throughout the entire country of Ukraine. And in response, you have Zelensky continuing to be defiant. And as we see how this drone strike and how the impact of these, because a great many of them actually found their targets and actually struck what they were shooting at. What you're seeing right there was actually in Kiev city itself at one of the big energy and electricity production facilities. So that's appeared to be one of the primary targets of this entire operation, is to continue to cripple the Ukraine ability to support their war and even support their civilian infrastructure in terms of electricity, and soon going to be heat when we get into the cold season, what's all coming. To try and help us break down the significance of this and where this war is going, we have back with us Matthew Hoh, former State Department official, former combat Marine, and just really intelligent, great guy. Matt, welcome back to the show.
Hi, Danny. Thanks. Nice to be back with you.
Always great to have you on here, because you always have some great insights. But I want to talk about a couple of things, because just kind of first of all, I think with this latest strike, we're starting to see, we're continuing to see that some people still seem oblivious to not want to see, and that is that the power discrepancy between Russia and the Ukraine, and that means the Ukraine side and all that goes along with it, is just actually continuing to escalate in the direction of Russia and minimize in the direction of Ukraine. The fact that you had a lot of these strikes that actually found their targets in Kiev city and some of the other major places is graphic evidence that the air defense capacity of the Ukraine side, even in their capital, is starting to fall apart. What does that tell you generally?
I think what you've seen is just we're seeing the consequences of one bad decision by the U.S., NATO, Ukraine after another, in terms of bringing upon an unbearable and, as you said, unending plight on the Ukrainian people. The idea of which, of course, is I think there are many in Kyiv, many in London, Brussels, and in DC who are not opposed to these attacks on civilian infrastructure in Ukraine by the Russians, because this is what they can then use to say, look how bad the Russians are, look how evil they are. This is why we need to send the Ukrainians more weapons, more money. This is why we have to put our own troops into Ukraine, right? So there's, of course, that's an incredibly cynical thing to say, but look who I'm talking about. You know, I'm talking about London, Washington, Brussels, Kyiv. So of course they think this way. It's the consequences of Ukrainian and NATO choices, because remember, in the first 6 months of this war, you didn't have these types of strikes on energy infrastructure, on critical civilian infrastructure, like you have seen since October of 2022. And what, of course, happened.
And Matt, if I can just point out, as you're talking there, this graphic that Gary's showing there, just see these are cruise missiles that are coming in really slow. None of them are intercepted.
Yeah.
This is in Kiev city.
Right, exactly. So that's the other thing. So what I was getting at with in terms of the consequences of choices is that these attacks on the civilian infrastructure occur after Ukraine and or NATO attacks the Kerch Bridge, and of course also destroys the Nord Stream pipeline. So you have one cause and effect after another. And to your point, Danny, you're in a position where I'm reminded of people familiar with the Marvel films and Captain America. And, he gets into a fight with somebody and he says, I can do this all day. And that's how I feel about the Russians at this point, where they're able to say, because they're so much, their capacity is so great in terms of their ability to produce missiles, produce bombs, produce munitions at a scale and at a rate that allows them to continue to do these types of onslaughts. Yes, what we saw over the past day was the largest Russian assault using drones and bombs and missiles in a couple of months. But we also have to remember that just because that was the largest, but daily there are these types of strikes. And particularly on the tactical and operational level as well, the ability of the Russians just to pound the Ukrainians with their air force using, what are called glide bombs. So dropping these huge bombs, 2,000 pound, 3,000 pound bombs from 40 miles away or so. Yeah. And they seem to have an unlimited supply of those. So it really is this question when you've put yourself into a war of attrition, Now, the choices that the Ukrainians are making, in that NATO and the United States is in their backers are really help propel them along in those choices, or to continue to double down. This idea that at some point the Russians will run out, at some point the Russians will collapse, or it's just a question of we just have to provide more, or it gets to the point where we're just going to get the right stuff. And then it'll escalate to the point that the Americans will have to come in, NATO will have to come in. And I think that's a lot. And we're going to talk about Kursk. I think that's a lot of what the when you talk about the political decision making in this, as well as political / strategic decision making, that's so much of the Ukrainians' desire, so much of their hopes, their strategy. It's a strategy of hope that the United States and NATO will eventually come into this and save them. So they're going to do everything they can to ratchet it up to that point, including doing things that allow the Russians to be portrayed as evil, as barbaric, as causing great harm to the civilians. And how could you not intervene, right? So the idea is that, we've seen this before. If people go back almost 30 years now, right? When the United States and NATO intervene in Yugoslavia, what's the precipitating factor? A mortar shell hits a marketplace, kills 100 people, and we have to go in. How can the world stand by? And that's essentially what the strategy, or the strategy of hope that Ukraine has, I think really is this idea of how do we make it so that the U.S. and the West are propelled into this war. And they're having some success with that.
Yeah. Now I'm gonna show you actually a pretty graphic demonstration of exactly what you're talking about in terms of the messaging from Zelensky. But before I get to that one, there's another one that I think is really interesting, because this is going to inadvertently show the additional compounding effects of our bad strategy elsewhere in the world. And you're going to hear him in just a second talk about something that happened in the Middle East and why can't it happen here. And one of the things that I think may be playing out, especially with this Kursk incursion, which we will talk about in a second, is that Zelensky is looking over to the Middle East and he's seeing our engagements with Netanyahu and how Netanyahu's basically calling the shots and doing whatever it seems that he wants to do, whether we are aware of it or whether we approve of it or not, and then putting us in a position where we have to respond to it. So now watch what he says here about referring to that, and then we'll talk about it on the backside.
Сьогодні були у них мішені на Волині, на Львівщині, на Франківщині, Вінницька область, Хмельницька, наша Тернопільщина, в різних наших регіонах України ми змогли би зробити значно більше для захисту життя, якби авіація наших європейських сусідів працювала разом з нашими F-16 і разом з нашою ППО. Якщо така єдність, очевидно, ефективно спрацювала на Близькому Сході, це повинно працювати і в Європі. Всюди життя має однакову цінність.
So now what he's referring there, in case anybody missed it, is back in, I think it was April or whenever it was, that Iran attacked Israel in response to the embassies, that embassy complex that Israel destroyed in Syria, the Iranian embassy up there. And then Iran responded to that. And then as to join in with them, basically the U.S. Air Force was loaned out to Tel Aviv, and so that they would be able to use them. We ended up shooting down like 70 of the things. And so he's saying, hey, man, it worked out good there, and that the French were also in the Jordanians as well. So he's like, hey, man, cool. That worked then. How about giving us some love? So I want y'all to fight my air war for us. I mean, that's what he's actually saying.
Right. And this weekend we saw it with those Israeli strikes into Lebanon, very clearly stated U.S. Reconnaissance and intelligence and surveillance assets, whether it was aircraft or satellites or drones or whatever, were utilized in helping the Israelis target Hezbollah positions. I mean, so it's clear that we do that. And of course, if you're Zelensky looking at this, you say, why can't I have this? And one of the things, Danny, we've talked about before about what we think, particularly in the Middle East, this genocide in Gaza, this crisis will precipitate. What's going to come about 5 years from now, 10 years from now, whatever. Some of those things we've talked about before. This idea, as we're seeing these nations, kind of what Zelensky's saying, we have to band together, we have to unify, right, and we have to work together to stand up to the American empire and its proxies. The other one, of course, is Israel has a nuclear weapon. We don't. Right. I mean, Ukraine is essentially in the same category as that. And you hear that discussion around and around. Oh, if Ukraine had only not given up its nuclear weapons in 1994 or whenever, this would have never happened, right? It's this idea that we're going to see further nuclear proliferation. And the third one that particularly pertains to Americans is this idea of look how successful the Israeli lobby is. And so if you're the Ukrainians, if you're anybody, you know, you have to be looking at this and saying, we have to emulate that. Look, it's not that easy to bribe the American system, to game the American political system, to control it. It's built that way. It's a system of legalized bribery. So in order for us to get what we need from the United States, we have to emulate the Israelis and how they do things. You know, and that's essentially, I think, what Zelensky's talking about here is making it to the point that it's impossible for there to be any other political choice for the Americans but to support, you know, these proxies, these clients, these vassals, you know, whatever you want to call them. Yeah, I mean, I think that even if things were to end today militarily, the consequences of all this going forward, how this ripples out, right, and what it pretends and what it creates, you know, it makes, you know, the instability and the danger just is I feel like it's growing exponentially.
Well, right. And as you said, if it was over today, but it's not, it is continuing to go on. Yeah. And so here's Zelensky demonstrating what you said just a second ago and a little bit more about, of course, it's basically Hitler without the mustache with Vladimir Putin. So, yeah, so you should do it. More than that, now he's going to talk about that, but then in the rest of this clip, he's going to talk about basically how it's your fault that we're not winning here, and get on the damn plane and let's get this done. Watch this.
Не зраджує, це хвора істота, всім вже давно зрозуміло, але так само зрозуміло він може робити тільки те, що світ йому дозволяє робити. Слабкість, недостатність рішень у відповідь живить терор. І кожен лідер, кожен наш партнер знає, які сильні рішення потрібні, щоб всю цю війну припинити і припинити справедливо. Не може бути в Україні обмежень в далекобійності, коли у терористів немає таких обмежень. Не може бути у захисників життя обмежень у зброї, коли Росія використовує і власну зброю всіх типів, і шахеди, і балістику з Північної Кореї. Америка, Британія, Франція, інші партнери мають силу, щоб допомогти нам зупинити терор. Потрібні рішення.
So let's be clear here. What he's saying is, come join us, go to war with Russia for me, for my country. So you should risk nuclear war on our behalf. I want to make sure that's abundant up front when anyone hears this message, because no one's talking about that part. He just wants it to be conventional, stay conventional, drive Russia out conventional, and then yay, we win, end of day, with, you know, the credits rolling and the inspiring music playing in the background like in a movie, except it won't end like in a movie, Matt.
Well, he's playing a character here. I mean, we're in the 30th month or 31st month of Zelensky playing dress up. You know, guy looks like he just walked out of a Bass Pro Shop, right? I mean, he's been doing that it's a role he is playing. But that's also the way the Americans understand this, in the Brits, and most of NATO does as well, with a few exceptions like Hungary and Slovakia. This idea that what matters is the political theater, and particularly the political theater of the moment, right? So you have to always be portraying an image, and your policy has to reflect the narrative, right? Because you're trying, you always got to win on the stage. You've always got to have a victorious political theater that you're showing. But there's also there's a longer play at this as well. I don't want to make it seem as if this is only about it's not even the 24-hour news cycle anymore. It's about the 15-minute news cycle probably. But this idea is a longer play here, and you hinted at that, Danny, as well. And this idea that it's already this betrayal, this story of a betrayal has already been set up. It's been set up for a while. It's been called out for a while. But you're really starting to see it ratcheted up. I've seen it probably 3 or 4 times in Politico this month. really important stories out of Political. They don't make you feel good, but they really expose the thinking behind those who are driving this war. Political is probably one of the most pro-Ukraine war publications, in the U.S. It's an international outlet, really. But this idea that Joe Biden has a legacy, and his legacy and this is what's coming from members of the American Congress. His legacy can either be one of standing up for democracy and defeating the dictator Putin, or one of betrayal, right? And does he want his legacy to be that he didn't give Ukraine the weapons they needed to win this war? In just a couple of days, I screenshotted it. Hang on one second. Open my phone. Political article from August 23rd. And not to jump ahead of where you wanted to go here, Danny, but we're talking about Kursk. I know you want to do that, but Ukraine uses this is the headline. Ukraine uses Kursk success to press Biden on lifting weapons restrictions. And the first paragraph is, Ukraine's invasion of Russia has flipped the gloomy narrative on the war, and Kyiv is using its battlefield success to launch a new pressure campaign on the U.S. to lift the last restrictions on the use of long-range weapons inside of Russia, right? I mean, so you see, it's even the Kursk incursion, invasion, whatever you want to call it. It was a political stunt. That's how, I mean, there's operational significance to it. There's, of course, you start wondering where you pull apart the politics and the political and the strategic. But to me, essentially, it was a political stunt done. Oh, hey, good job, Gary. We didn't even coordinate that. But to do, do exactly this, to get this type of narrative out there, to get these headlines out there about how Ukraine is now winning the war. And of course, what did you see happen, within days of this invasion of Russia by Ukraine? But you had the two biggest pro-Ukraine war hawks in the U.S. Senate, if not in all of Washington, D.C., Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal in Kyiv, and Graham saying, this is why we need to get funding again for Ukraine, right? Kicking it off the FY25 appropriations for Ukraine. So, basically saying this is why we need to send another 60 or 70 or $80 billion to Ukraine. And we need to get that done in December, which is when the budget's supposed to be done. Right. So, I mean, you could see how this is just one big political theater, act of political theater, in order to continue to propel the war along. And there are those who want this war to go on for a variety of reasons. But the one thing it all comes back to is that they're all okay with the Ukrainian people being sacrificed for their purposes, whether it's imperial megalomania, whether it's commercial greed, whether it's the greed of the military-industrial complex, whether it's political desire, whether it's because Zelensky is playing the greatest role of the century, right? I mean, all those things, but the reality is that the Ukrainian people are being used as pawns for that.
Yeah, and I do want to go there now. You were talking about the Kursk area and how it's political theater. I want to try and explain a little bit why that is. So this is the map of the war. This is where primarily most of the fighting has been in this roughly 600-kilometer or 600-mile front line for most of the past 2 years or even more than that. And then here recently, we had a little bit open up in the northern part of Kharkiv with the Russians, where they came in and had an interdiction, but didn't go very far, and then just kind of stayed there with a static situation. And then you had the Ukraine side open up here in the Kursk region. Now, just so you understand what you're looking at here, the pink area is where Russian forces are. They have basically cordoned off this area right here. The Ukraine side, all this blue area, this is the border. So they have penetrated this far up into the border, and you see a number of fingers that have kind of gone off up in there. Some of these are now starting to get peeled off, but here's what you see. That in these areas here, this has not much changed in like the last 7, 8, 10 days. Mm-hmm. By the time at first Russia was completely caught off guard, Ukraine mounted a number of troops in the area that under the guise of defending if Russia attacked in Sumy, and instead they used them to attack here where Russia was not prepared. So of course it's kind of a wide open area. There's no military bases here. It's just a bunch of villages. So it was the least defended and the least obstacles to going up forward. So they've done. Well, now here's the problem. This is a nation of 140 million people that's as vast as 12 time zones and, you know, all the vastness of Russia with all of their industrial capacity. You can't send about 10, 20,000 people and invade Russia and think that you're going to be able to pull that off and stay there. You're either going to have to basically treat it as a raid and then withdraw, or you're going to have to do what it appears they're doing now, send more reinforcements in so that you can keep these fingers, which are incredibly difficult to defend against. And Matt, I wonder if you could, first of all, while we got this map up here, if you could talk about the military difficulty for the Ukraine side in this environment.
Well, exactly that. I think the primary, the first aspect was what you just spoke about, Danny, is this idea of resupply, of getting your forces the things they need to not just continue to fight, but to continue to live. I mean, so this idea that maybe these 10,000 troops that were sent in there, this was the plan all along, and that they were basically going to turn into some type of guerrilla force and just be a thorn in the side of Russia, and they're going to live off the land, and et cetera, et cetera. But you know, that doesn't work so well in practice, in particular when you're talking about wanting to have any type of operational or strategic effect on the Russians. You have to make it so that they have to respond. I mean, what has surprised most people in these last 3 weeks is by the limit of Russia's response. How cavalierly, how nonchalantly the Russians have taken this. I think most of us were saying, well, the Russians are just going to smash this right away and drive the Ukrainians across. You know, they have to. That was my thoughts on this, and others shared the same, that there's no way the Russians can allow the Ukrainians to occupy 1 inch of land. Well, now this incursion occurred on August 6th. We're getting close to a month's time. Right. And the Russians seem as if they're okay with just keeping these guys trapped here. And the idea then, too, is that it allows for the Russians to portray this, what the Russians are calling it a counterterrorism operation, a CTO. So they're portraying it. They're splitting it off in their messaging from the rest of the war. And if people are familiar with the Russians, why CTO, people may say, hey, that sounds familiar. CTO is what the Russians called their operations, their war in Chechnya, counter-terror operations. And of course, for the Russian people, that has a lot of connotation with actual terror attacks within Russia throughout that time period, residential building bombings, subway bombings. You know, you had the Black Widows, as they were called. You had that horrible massacre at the school. People remember that, going on 20 years now. But that ties in very well to this overall idea of what Russia is doing here, is protecting their people. That this is first and foremost a war about Russian national security. So if the idea was that we're going to rattle the Russians, we're going to shake the Russian people, we're going to cause a lot of problems for the Russian government politically by occupying this land, that's not the case, because the Russians are portraying this as an extension of previous terrorist operations, previous terrorist attacks. And of course, how do they kind of rightfully describe a lot of Ukraine's actions on Russian soil preceding this, whether it's been the assassinations, drone attacks on the Kremlin. I mean, certainly let's not forget back in March, you had the horrible mass shooting at the concert hall in Moscow, which was tied, the Russians claim was tied to Ukraine. I mean, so
yeah, and Matt, let me interrupt you, because there's a new one to add to the list you just gave there today. So in a city called Saratov in southern Russia, Ukraine sent a bunch of drones in that direction as well. And watch the video footage of one hitting a apartment complex. Watch this.
Right.
Here, if you could throw that up there. What image does that line up in your mind?
Gosh, takes you back almost 23 years, right?
Yeah, you know? Something like that. Yeah. And there's another angle. Watch this one, Gary. If you can throw that other one up there. No, not that. The other angle of the building, because it shows a little bit more. Yeah, you have that other video, Gary, the different one. Okay, well, I guess maybe we don't have that other one, but there was one that showed it. Here we go. Look at that. Watch this. It flies in. Bam. You actually see it on the front side. That, folks, is an apartment complex. It's not a military industrial capacity. It's not a defense industry. It's certainly not a military target. It's an apartment complex. And so what do you think that that's going to do in the Russian media when they see that a very pinpoint strike from Ukraine hit an apartment building? I mean, that just feeds the narrative. It doesn't. I think, Matt, that some have this fantasy that these kinds of strikes, the incursion into Kursk, these kinds of things are going to make the Russian people go, "Oh shoot, man! I didn't know that the war was going to cost anything. I'm going to now be mad at Vladimir Putin, tell him to end it." Do you think that's very likely?
No, I mean, and I think there are probably some within Ukraine and within NATO who are foolish about that, who just haven't read their history. You read any historical study of air campaigns, and it says the same thing. Air campaigns do not affect the morale of the bombed. What they tend to do is actually improve the morale. It tends to unite people. It tends to
hardens them.
Right, exactly. And so that's what you're doing. So these types of campaigns, again, there's some fools in Ukraine and in NATO who believe that that's what's going to happen. But you also have this idea that we have to do it for the audience. You're right. We're showing we're taking it to the enemy. We're giving it to them as good as we're getting it. But also to portraying, you're following the narrative. This is the most important thing. You're following the narrative, this narrative that goes back 2.5 years now, right? It even predates it. There's the idea that the purpose of this war in Ukraine is to cause such stress, cause such distress to Russia, its population, its economy, within its political ranks, that we're going to get regime change. It's going to collapse from the inside because of this war. And this type of thing, it feeds the minds of those who are in DC and in London and Brussels that, yes, this will rattle them and this will cause tension. It'll cause friction, and people will rise up and they'll overthrow Vladimir Putin. And I mean, it's complete nonsense. I mean, but this is what sustains them. This is what, and some of them are dumb enough to believe it, and others who just want to see the war going on, again, for reasons I described before, personal and institutional. This is something to latch onto.
Look, here's one of the things. So probably related to that, what they want the feeling in Russia to be. Again, this is, I think you called it a strategy of hope at the middle. Maybe it would be cool if this happened, detached from whether it's even reasonable or possible, but that is. And so the statement was by some, especially Zelensky himself, and definitely Yermak early, said this is to give the Ukraine side good leveraging for negotiation, so if they can get a good negotiating position out of it. And in fact, one of the members of parliament for Ukraine said exactly that. Watch this.
What are your thoughts, at least on the process of potential peace talks? Do you believe that this will happen towards the end of the year?
Well, it's not just, some sort of a fetish that we need to sit and talk to Russia. We're not discussing this plan that Russia put on the table, basically, asking for capitulation of Ukraine. It cannot be the case.
Right.
So it's very important that Prime Minister Modi said that we need to respect UN Charter. And UN Charter clearly says that it's against the rules when one country invades another and is changing the borders of other country, is annexing territory and basically ruining the world order that was made after the Second World War. So if we stay on this basis, the negotiations should be on the just terms.
So, yeah, it would be cool if we had just terms and we could get the terms we want, even though we're on the military losing side. But then if anyone had any doubt, and you don't, because any logical person wouldn't, but if they did, let's see what the Russian side said about that very idea of negotiations.
Кто с ними после этого вообще будет договариваться? После тех бесчинств, того террора, который они устраивают в отношении мирных жителей, гражданского населения, гражданской инфраструктуры и мирных объектов. Те попытка ВСУ вторгнуться на нашу территорию априори, я еще раз подчеркну то, что было сказано российским руководством, априори аннулирует возможность каких-либо переговоров.
So they're saying, yeah, forget it. We're not doing any, there won't be any negotiations. And by the way, that is in reference to the last public offer of negotiations that Putin made. I want to say it was on the 14th of June, where he said, hey, we'll take all of Crimea and the 4 total oblasts that we illegally annexed, in 2022, I think late 2022, even though there's still Ukraine troops on that. He said, if y'all leave all that stuff, we'll take that and we'll call it a day. And it'll be it'll be an end to the war, etc. And of course, the Ukraine side said, yeah, we're not going to give up stuff that we actually have. But this has always been the perverse of it. If you don't take that bad deal, every time the time passes, the deal gets worse.
Right. It's I think there's two camps within Ukraine NATO on this. One who actually think negotiations are possible, are inevitable. They've been spooked by this because you have seen the Ukrainians, Zelensky, who have said, our next peace conference, we're going to invite the Russians. This idea that Donald Trump may win the presidency. So maybe it's better to do negotiations now before Trump wins, before a deal is forced upon us, right? And then things change with the American elections. And now it's not so clear that Donald Trump is going to run away with the election. So maybe there's a chance to keep this war going. So I think there are some in the camp who really do believe that holding this land in Russia is going to be good for us in negotiations. But I also think, and this gets back to that those who want to see this war go on and who are looking for ways, the idea that this is one big political stunt. Well, they had to know. They had to know that this is going to be Russia's reaction. So was the purpose of the Kursk incursion to take away the chance in negotiations, to make it impossible for the U.S. and NATO to do anything other than to continue to support Russia? I mean, to continue to support Ukraine, right? So whereas there is no choice, there is no possibility of negotiations, we have to give them $75 billion more. Otherwise, we'll be betraying them, right? This whole political narrative
That's fascinating.
Just keeps stacking itself on. It keeps reinforcing itself. It's one big loop, and it's effective. It's effective. So now, of course, if you're reading the American press, the British press, the German press, whatever, what are you going to see? You're not going to see that drone striking that apartment building. You're not going to see what the Russian people see. And then vice versa. They don't see what we see either. But it's going to be about how Russia won't negotiate. And these sparky Ukrainians that are like the Spartans of Europe. You've seen that, right? That Ukraine is essentially Gallipoli, right? And they're holding off the barbarians from the civilization. I mean, like, that narrative keeps turning. It keeps going. And so this idea of maybe this Kursk incursion was a way to get rid of negotiations, the possibility of it, so that there is no other alternative than to continue this war. And I guarantee you, if we had been in Chicago last week, Danny, and we were at the DNC, and whether we were on the convention floor or we were up in the corporate suites where they were paying millions of dollars a day for those, any conversation about Ukraine would have been along the lines of, yeah, you see what the Ukrainians have done? You see what they did, how they're taking it to the Russians? How can we turn away from them now? Biden was right about this all along, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And yeah, they'll get there come in December. There'll be 100 some odd Republicans who will vote against it. And that'll be about it. And Ukraine will get its 60, 70, 80 billion dollars more. The idea, of course, goes this thing of that. I think what the Ukrainians and NATO accurately assess, this is something that you and I talk about and others talk about this, right? Is that the Russians have no interest in capturing all of Ukraine. That was never their interest. That was never their goal. It's limited territorial conquest at this point, which actually is different than it was 2.5 years ago, when it really was about enforcing. I think Minsk II would be a good way to describe it. Yeah. But now it's a territorial thing. And I think I think in NATO and in Ukraine, they understand that the Russians really don't want to go any farther west than they have to. Where they've stated, what they've stated they want, and what was announced like this summer, as you were talking about with the deal that the Russians were offering Crimea and the 4 oblasts. That's what they want. They don't want to be an army of occupation. They don't want to have this problem, and they don't want to have a forever war. And I think what you have is U.S., NATO, and Ukrainians who look at this and say, we can trade land for time. We can trade land for endless war. Because so what if the Russians move 50 kilometers west? So
okay.
All the way to the river.
It's as though you already read my mind. You know what's coming. Because flawlessly feeding into that narrative right here is one of the people that helps support that view is retired 3-star General Ben Hodges.
Oh, that's
who
your good
said,
buddy.
I think this was yesterday, but he mentions that issue about the 50 kilometers. Watch this.
If you're the commander of Ukrainian forces there, or you are a soldier there in the Pokrovsk area, it sucks. I mean, you're under enormous pressure from Russian forces. You know you don't have enough ammunition to do what needs to be done. But I think that Ukrainian General Staff has done its analysis, has realized that it has to take some risk in the eastern part of Ukraine in order to launch this counteroffensive in the direction of Kursk, which will have significant strategic effect. So I think we want to put the Pokrovsk situation in context. Avdiivka was captured by the Russians finally after a long fight way back in February. It is only about 50 kilometers from Avdiivka to Pokrovsk. So in other words, it's taken the Russians 6 months to get within 10 kilometers of Pokrovsk at the cost of thousands of casualties. So I don't see the Russians having the ability to overrun Ukrainian defenses or exploit any local successes that they have achieved thus far.
Okay, so I want your view on that. And while you're doing that, I'm going to pull that map back up, because basically, no, two things I want to know. First of all, at the first part of the video there, his comments there, he said that there is something of strategic value to gain up in this Kursk. Do you see any, being generous?
No, I mean, the political value, but strategic in terms of it having an impact on the war. No, I mean, the status quo, when I say status quo, I mean, neither side can throw a punch that's going to knock the other side out. It doesn't change. It's still this war of attrition where the Russians have limited territorial objectives, and then you have those in the West who want this thing to go on forever because they have this fantasy about internal Russian regime change, as we were talking about. This doesn't affect that at all. It doesn't change anything. The Ukrainians used a small amount of troops in the grand scale, 10,000. At some point, those 10,000 troops, might they wish they had them in the East? Possibly, but at the same time, too, I really think that they're willing, and I can't believe I'm in agreement with Hodges here, that they're willing to trade that land for the political success. Right, going to go back to the political article today about the great success of the invasion in Ukraine of Kursk by Ukraine. They're willing to trade land in the East. The other thing too is that, again, look, even if the Russians push all the way west to the river, does anyone in their right mind think that they're going to try and make those river crossings? I mean, like, even just disregard what the Russians have said about it, all the evidence of the last couple of years, anything that makes sense, and say they actually made it to all the way to the river, all the way up to Kyiv. So from Kherson to Kyiv, they've occupied all of that. Does anyone think they're actually going to try and cross that river? I mean, like, it just makes no sense as a possibility to be done from what we've seen in these last 2.5 years of war, let alone you look at that map and you see how far they have to go. And so this idea then gets back to this point for, the West, for the Americans, the Brits, NATO. This is a purpose. It wasn't so long ago, Danny, that there are very serious conversations about, like, does NATO have a purpose any longer? And this gives a purpose, because now Eastern Ukraine forms the basis for a crusade, right? This gives NATO meaning, right? I mean, Donetsk is the new Jerusalem, if you will, right? It has to be retaken. And so now you're looking at, potentially an endless war like we saw in Afghanistan or some other place where it just keeps going on.
Well, but here's what mitigates against that, though, in my view. So you saw Zakharovia there say that now there's no more negotiation. We're not even talking. What was on the table is now off the table. And many of the Russian military leaders, and it remains to be seen how much there is to this, but they said, now then we're going to go all the way down, and we're going to eventually, however long it takes, take Odessa, take Kharkiv, and at least invest Kiev, which is certainly possible, because here's the big risk. By having this forever war, Ukraine doesn't have forever troops. They keep dying in large numbers, and especially if there's a breakthrough down there in the Pokrovsk area I just highlighted a second ago, there could be a roll-up of this. And so we haven't seen any big movements really since the opening, like 2 or 3 weeks of the war. That's not to say that they can't also come if there's a break. And that's one of my big worries, that they're rolling the dice and gambling with the lives of all of these Ukrainian people.
We have to remember too, what were the Americans, what were the Brits saying 2.5 years ago when Russia invaded? There, this came from former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, was one of them who was saying this. Oh, this is great. We've got them exactly where we want them. We're going to do to them like we did to them in Afghanistan in the 80s. Right. When all of Washington and London was a flutter with this idea that the Russians were going to conquer the whole country in a week or whatever they were saying, this idea was that they're playing right into our hands. We're going to suck them into this occupation. And then there's going to be partisan and guerrilla warfare.
Yeah, I do remember
just
that
like
part.
we trained our Green Berets for decades to do in Europe. That's the whole purpose, of the establishment of special forces, was this idea we're going to drop these guys behind the lines in Europe after the Soviets conquered it and everything. I mean, so you've got this generational madness that gets passed down among the officers of the empire, that this is the way things need to proceed. These are our plans. This is what we think we need to do to achieve results. So this idea that for the West, and I think even for many of those in Ukrainian leadership, because they have no problem sacrificing their people these last 2.5 years, absolutely none. So the idea is you expend all of your manpower, and then what happens then? Your assumption is that the Russians are not going to go farther west than a certain point, and now you've got a frozen conflict. And now, of course, the Western military industrial complex likes it, because you just keep sending them weapons, artillery,
all that.
drones, right? Exactly that. And the war never becomes like the Korean conflict, but it's frozen on the ground. There's very little ground combat in the sense of force on force in terms of men, but there's a lot of force on force in terms of artillery, missiles, drones, etc. And that's what it looks like. And that's a win-win for everyone in the West, because Ukraine hasn't lost. Zelensky and his people still have the backing of the West. The Western weapons companies are making a ton of money. The American and British politicians who are so devoted to this, they still have their war. They have their crusade. They have their quest for, their Jerusalem, if you will, right? I mean, so you can see how the madness of this, where this could head to. And I think what we have, and it's a terrible position, like for you and I to be in, where we're looking at and we're hoping, now you and I are in a strategy of hope. We're hoping that the Russians are more mature than this, that the Russians are wiser than this, that the Russians won't fall into this trap, if you will, and get stuck into an endless war. Because there's still
but hang on. There's another alternative here. What if Russia makes good on their military claims and they do take these areas? And so this military gamble of having this long-term conflict starts to go, oh, crap, Ukraine might lose. And by having their army, even if they don't take all the territory, if they destroy the Ukrainian army, there's nothing left to defend it. That is a very real possibility.
Right. And so you do have then the case of like taking Odessa, Kherson. I mean, but that falls into then this idea that you're going to wage the Mujahideen in Afghanistan were very successful against the Soviets inside of Kabul. Right. You had the Night Letters campaign and all that type of stuff in the 80s. That's what these people envision. Oh, so if they take Odessa, Ukraine goes to hell. They have no ports, etc. But we have a chance to launch urban guerrilla warfare against the Russians. I mean, this is what these people are thinking. This is what I guarantee you, if we were sitting in the room and Blumenthal and Graham are getting briefed by Center for New American Security, they're getting briefed by the Institute of Study of War. This is the stuff that comes up. If it even gets this far in the conversation about what if. I have a feeling that you just kind of broke this down and led me down a path, Danny. This doesn't occur in any congressional office. They don't have any type of,
or they're not worried about it. That works too.
No. And I mean, I think one of the things for the Russians, of course, the Russian concern, I really, if I were them, I'd be very concerned about this, is a collapse of Ukraine, right? The collapse of the economy and the government. Certainly should be a huge concern for Europe, because they think they've got a lot of refugees now. Just wait. But this idea then that what Russia has, on their front yard, essentially, or backyard or side yard, whichever way you want to look at it, is a failed state. Exactly. That they've got a Syria, they've got an Afghanistan, they've got a Libya right there. And that country has warlords, and it has a ton of weapons, and there's a lot of cash running in and out of it. Right. And so Russia, I think, has to be very concerned about that happening. So what they're trying to balance here in terms of finesse without, of course, allowing these attacks to continue on their country. And they do have, the Russians, it gets back to this, is one of my criticisms of Russia, of course, is that how did this ultimately, and I do believe that they had national security concerns. They were provoked. I believe they didn't have to do this. They could have done other things, but they chose to do this out of national security reasons. That what does it do about the American missiles in Poland and Romania? And, last month we were told we're sending Tomahawks to Germany. They'll be there in a year or two. And we're old enough, Danny, to remember what happened when Reagan sent the Persian missiles to Europe, right? I mean, so yeah, again, where this goes as it spirals out.
There's all kinds of possibilities. And I'm sorry, I want to shut this off for the moment because we're running low on time. We actually have another show at 3:00. I realize we're running right up against it. But I don't want to let you go without looking at it. Another retired General Kellogg, former national security advisor to the Vice President Pence during the previous administration. He went on today to talk about a different topic with the Israel-Hamas war. And actually, in this case, it was Israel and Hezbollah. and he wanted to talk a little bit about what the problem is in the Middle East and who's actually to blame and what we should do about it. I want to show you 3 different parts of that clip and get your quick response to each one of those, because it's a head scratcher or an eye roller, which you would imagine just based on what I've already said. So here's the first one. Watch this.
I have to go back when you think about what's happened there is really the United States hasn't played a major role there in kind of de-escalating the situation, because President Biden hasn't done a lot in talking to Netanyahu. Vice President Harris hasn't done very much. I mean, she actually stiffed Netanyahu when he came here to the joint session of Congress when he spoke. And you've got Blinken going over there on his 9th trip, no ceasefire. And you got the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, heading to China instead of going to the Middle East. Now, I know CQ Brown's going to be there, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, but you kind of got to focus in on what's going to happen there and prevent something happening into the future. And they haven't done it, but the Israelis have done it. So the Israelis have done, actually, is reset deterrence in the region, and I think it's smart. And I think it's put Hezbollah on their back foot, and it's clearly put the Iranians on their back foot, that they haven't done anything at all.
So first of all, has what Israel did last night with the strike into Hezbollah in Lebanon, did that put Iran on its back foot? And are they now going to rethink whether they should retaliate for what happened in their capital?
No, absolutely not. I mean, this idea that somehow, first of all, this idea that it was, as you heard American commentators, this preemptive strike that stopped Hezbollah. Hezbollah launched like 350 Katyusha rockets and a whole bunch of drones, some of which might have hit Israel's the equivalent of their NSA. We don't know. We can't believe anything the Israelis say, of course, and we just don't know. But yeah, this idea that this has reestablished deterrence and somehow this is going to cause the Iranians to back off, it's just madness. And then it's as untrue as this idea that somehow Biden hasn't done enough to support Israel, which is basically what Kellogg was alluding to there, which is funny because it comes on the same day that we saw figures coming out of Israel through the Times of Israel that say that there have been more than 500 747 and C-17 flights of munitions, equipment, supplies, and 107 ships. You guys know how big a ship is? And actually it comes out to the Times of Israel report that since October 7th, the U.S. has sent 50,000 tons of military supplies to Israel. Among that is 14,000 2,000-pound bombs, right? So this idea that I will agree with Kellogg, though, because he says Biden hasn't done enough to de-escalate it. He doesn't mean it in the sense that a normal, rational, honest person would mean it, but he hasn't done anything to de-escalate it. What he's done is been able to be escalated because of his actions,
Okay. Next thing he said was, fortunately, he makes it simple for all of us to understand. This is really not a problem. There's a good guys and there's bad guys. And all we got to do is be on the side of the good guys. And this is not going to be a problem. Watch this.
The problem you get is if something like this extends, which it's done, it makes it harder to put back in the box, to make it put it into a situation which is sustainable in peace in the region. And that is because, frankly, we kind of backed away and we said, well, there's pox on both sides of the house. Wrong. The way you handle that is you tell the entire region, you tell the world, we are behind the Israelis, full stop. There's a good side and a bad side, and we need to do it. Because we haven't done it, we've created a seam, a gap. And adversaries look for seams and gaps, and they've basically done that. And so they say, okay, we can attack because the United States is not going to come back hard. And I think how you have to reset the fight You have to tell everybody in the region who we're for and who we're not for. And we really haven't done that. So it's going to take a bit to put it back in the box because Hezbollah is going to keep attacking. Iran's going to keep supporting the attackers in Hezbollah.
That last part there, man, we haven't done it. We haven't said who the good guys and who the bad guys are. We need to really do that. Yeah, I don't know how much harder we could get than that.
Yeah, the countries in the region don't know whose side we're on. We're sending mixed messages here.
Very mixed messages.
If there's anything I think of our conversation for folks who are watching this, I think is really important to take away of everything we said. The scariest thing is what you just heard there, in the sense that this is what a national security advisor to the president of the United States looks like. Kellogg was Pence's national security advisor. He was the chief of staff for the National Security Council. This is what a modern American NSA national security advisor looks like. They are political. There is not one shred of professionalism, of competence, of actual honest analysis in anything they say. Everything they say is geared through a partisan American political lens meant to achieve some type of political, institutional, or individual gain. And that's the reality. And Jake Sullivan is no different in this. And that was a good exposure. How can you have a man who has a national security advisor frame the situation in the Middle East in the way he just framed it, unless he is just a complete political grifter?
No, and you could certainly say, I mean, Secretary of State Blinken is in some ways worse in some of the things he says. But you have Blinken, you have Austin, you have here Kellogg that just said the U.S. should be unequivocally full stop behind whatever Israel wants to do, and no consideration to the Palestinians, 5 million people in the West Bank and Gaza, which aren't even in his calculation. And that's why when he says good guys, bad guys, he eliminates them as even an entity. And that's one of the big so-called disputes on the American side, especially in the Democratic side among their voting population, is that they care a lot, a good portion of them, about the Palestinian people. And that's where a lot of the pressure is getting on the Biden-Harris administration. He wants to just eliminate that. Don't even worry about them. Let's go all in with Israel no matter what. And I personally found that morally repugnant.
It is. It's scaremongering. It's there's a social scientist in the 50s, a big fan of his, guy named C. Wright Mills. He called it the higher immorality. This idea that the rules, the moral rules as we understand them, don't apply to the elite, and that the American public accepts that and it allows for it. This higher immorality that people like Kellogg, people like Blinken, they can say whatever they want. They don't have to adhere to actually what reality is, because they are among the elite, and the elite are forgiven for any trespasses on anything that we would be held accountable for as ourselves. And you see that this idea that you have a man who is presumptively possibly the next national security advisor in a Trump administration, on the biggest cable news network in the United States, just saying things that are just patently untrue, things that are false, things that are just so different from what the reality is. And it's all part of the show, folks. It's all part of the show. Just let it proceed, And so the idea that you have in the Oval Office, this is the advice. You could break, Danny, you could go in there. Doug McGregor could go in there. John Mearsheimer, Jeff Sachs, all these folks that you have come on who really understand things and could really give really great objective advice that is strong, because you look back at these people's records and you say, man, that guy was right about that and that and that. It wouldn't matter. It wouldn't matter, because it's a filter that the empire puts in place, that in the filter themselves are people like Kellogg, who are, again, political grifters. He was a 3-star general at one point, but I bet anything he sucked. I mean, like I got to say, and it was all about himself, all about climbing the career ladder, those kind of things. I know he's decorated in Vietnam, he's special forces in Cambodia. I know all that, but still, you look at this and you say, how could someone say something so completely divorced from reality?
Okay, and here's the problem. That's been a good assessment thus up to this point. What I'm about to play takes it to a whole new level of disconnected from reality. Watch this.
I think the Hamas fight is virtually over. I think Israelis has kind of solve that problem. Look, when the leader of Hamas has said, if we have peace discussions and we have a ceasefire, I want to make sure that I'm not a target. Sinwar, nope. You started that fight. You're at risk right now. But I think that fight is virtually over now. The Israelis can pivot to Hezbollah.
So good news, man. The Hamas war is effectively over.
Yeah.
What planet is he on? What is he talking about? That thing is not even close to being over.
Right. And I think he honestly does believe that it started on October 7th. He makes that comment there. Hey,
Yeah.
I think he honestly, in his mind, there is no pretext to this. There is no antecedent or anything. This all started, history started October 7th. And I think there are people, believe it or not, because I know the folks who watch this aren't like that. Folks who watch this show, you study history, you follow current events, you take this stuff seriously. But there are a lot of people. I mean, that's what I would say about people asking about Washington, D.C. What's so surprising about it is how ahistorical the knowledge is. And I would say this too. People ask about Afghanistan and Iraq, and I would say, you know what's going to shock you? The number of American diplomats and military officers who actually read a book about Iraq or a book about Afghanistan before they went over there, single-digit percentage. That the idea that this becomes cumbersome, it's inconvenient. And then if you're, again, a political grifter like General Kellogg, it becomes very troublesome to the narrative that you're trying to throw out there.
Yeah, it's hard for me to fathom. By the way, we have a few more minutes here. It's hard for me to fathom how we get to a point like this, that we have. I haven't read that work you're talking about. I'd be interested in going to find it, but that there is this almost acceptance among the regular people of a behavior and a commentary and the lies and distortions at the upper levels that would never be tolerated at a normal human level, when the consequences of that could be so catastrophic. Now, I fear that, for example, with the Afghan fiasco that you and I have been beating our heads about, on each other's shoulders since 2009, about how absurd it is and how it was destined for a loss, and all the consequence and all the people in Afghanistan that paid with such a terrible price, how predictable the end was, et cetera. But when the predictable end came, and you had the Petraeuses and even the Lindsey Grahams and all these other people who say it was everybody else's fault except their own, even though they advocated for it, there was no real cost to the United States. It's like another embarrassment, another Vietnam. Okay. And that didn't cost us anything here either. So we just keep going on. But one of these days, it's going to cost us something. Right now, it's costing the Palestinian people something, just an egregious cost. It's even costing the Israeli people a lot of cost, because this war is continuing to go on. He is dead wrong when he says this is about over. They have created so many more enemies in the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank than ever existed prior to October 7th because of what the Israelis done. So if they think that it's almost over, they're in for a very rude surprise. But I just don't know, and I'd like your view in the last comment here. Is there any hope that we're going to get to a point to where we're going to finally recognize that there is this duplicity from up here to down there that needs to be ended?
I don't know, Danny. I don't know. So C. Wright Mills, he wrote this. I think he coined it in The Causes of World War III. The other book that I recommend people read of his is The Power Elite. And he wrote those in like 55, 56, around that time frame. I want to thank my friend Jonathan, actually, who's a big fan of your show, because he reminded me of that phrase, the higher immorality, a couple of weeks ago when we were texting each other. So it's been percolating in my head, and I finally had an opportunity to, use it here. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I mean, in a sense of does it take cataclysm? Does it take disaster for us? Look, I mean, look at how Europe was with itself, its wars of the 19th century that then led directly to World War I, that then, of course, then led to World War II. It took all of that tragedy, all of that horror, all of that destruction to bring about a Europe that was somewhat peaceable for several decades, right? Is it the same thing going to be required of us? We have a place in the United States where we don't feel these things. We feel like it's not going to affect us. And this is what our leaders bank on. This is what those in charge of the empire really cling to. This idea that we have buffers. Otto von Bismarck said, the United States has good neighbors to its north and south and fish to its east and west. right? You know, and Lincoln said this as well. We're protected by these two giant oceans. You know, I mean, so this idea that we have buffers, and then of course we've talked about this, the buffer with the Ukraine war is Finland, it's Poland, it's Romania. So if things even get so bad to the point that Russia starts using tactical nuclear weapons or anything like that, where are they going to use them first? They're not going to use them on us. They can use it on the Finns or the Poles or the Latvians or the Romanians. And at that point, then we can turn the dial down. Then we can de-escalate because they're our buffer. And I wish the Europeans understood that more. That you are our buffer. You know, I mean, so. And what we're doing is we're walking right into the long game of, you know, what the empire, who the empire's adversaries are, their long game. So if you look at this idea of what Hezbollah is doing, what Iran is doing, what the Yemenis are doing in support of the Palestinians, but also to bring harm to Israel, it's a long-term strategy. Israel is bleeding out right now. Their economy is just every day it's hemorrhaging. Their tourism is shut down, right? I mean, foreign investment is dried up. Domestic investment is being shipped out. One of their ports, one of their 4 decent ports is completely closed off. I mean, like just on and on we could go. They got 200,000 internal refugees in a population of 8 million. You've got what, several 100,000 reservists called up in a population of 8 million. I mean, you've had 40,000 Israeli businesses go out of business since October 7th.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah, I mean, the numbers are, and then you look at what's happening on the political side, right? You look at what's happening there, and you look at, okay, why should Iran launch a huge attack right now? Why should Hezbollah send anything more than 300 Katyusha rockets over the border? They don't need to. You know, next Tuesday, send 800 rockets. And then, you know, on September 15th, launch a few ballistic missiles. It's interesting that Hezbollah was quick to point that out, actually, that they didn't use any of their ballistic missiles in their attack the other day. They only used their Katyushas, which, as everyone knows,
it's
the world
like bottle rockets.
Yeah, and some drones. You know, I mean, so you're like this, string this thing out and let the Israelis devolve and crack apart internally. I don't even know if Netanyahu's out of that bunker. Netanyahu's spent most of the last 2-3 weeks in a bunker, right? So is this long-term game, you know, and balancing it with, okay, you know, the Americans, you know, Israel's whole card here is the Americans. And are the Americans really going to back an attack on Iran? And are the Israelis really stupid enough to invade Lebanon for the 3rd time in 40 months? And even if they did, what would be the consequences then for them? Because you saw how disastrous both those things were.
Yep.
So, I mean, like, I think, you know, you look at that and you say, God, our political leadership, you know, it's just, it doesn't just not care about its own people, but it's grossly inept. I mean, completely inept.
Well, we'll leave it there for right now because that pretty well puts a bow on it. I couldn't improve on anything you just said. So appreciate you coming on and providing such clarity to this as you always do. And we're going to continue to track it, especially as events continue to happen in both the Middle East as well as in Europe. And we'll bring it to you as it comes live and look forward to having you back on very soon.
Right. Thanks, Danny. And my best to you and your family, especially to your mom during this time. So, you know, my best to you all.
I appreciate you saying that. I really do. And I know my mom does as well. Thank you very much. And we appreciate you guys coming on today. Things are going to stay hot. We're going to keep on talking here. We're actually going to look at, we mentioned a little bit about who might be the next president. Well, we looked at Kamala Harris a couple of days ago. We're going to look now here at 3:30 about the Trump campaign trying to reset itself after the Democrats. We're going to talk to Jim Webb, a former political campaign leader, and he'll be giving you his scoop on that. Come back at 3:30. We'll be looking forward to seeing you then. Thanks very much, and we'll see you at Daniel Davis Deep Dive.